And another riveting hour to go here with Linda Moulton Howe. Linda, tell us about this training manual.
The first time that I saw it, which goes back into probably 15 years ago, I thought, this is the real deal. And so did Bob Wood. And Bob and I have known each other a long time. And on December 28th, Bob and Ryan Wood, who have been investigating what are called the Majestic 12 documents for a very long time, published an online article called Why the Critics Are Wrong About Psalm 101. Now, this is a publication that says it's by the United States War Office. It's dated April 1954. The title is Restricted Psalm 101 Majestic 12 Group Special Operations Manual, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal, Top Secret Magic Eyes Only. And there is also a stern warning that the training manual contains, quote, compartmentalized information essential to the national security of the United States, close quote. Well, Robert Wood has a Ph.D. He had a 43-year-long career as an aerospace engineer. He first worked for Douglas Aircraft that merged with the McDonnell Corporation in 1967 to become McDonnell Douglas, and then that was purchased by Boeing in the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. And over those 4 decades, Bob Wood worked on aerodynamic heating, ballistic missile defense, radar, and the space station before his retirement in 1993. And that year, nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton Friedman sent Bob Wood a strip of Tri-X 35-millimeter negatives that Stan had received from Don Berliner at the Fund for UFO Research based in Mount Rainier, Maryland. Berliner said that he received a green box used to ship film and photographs and was postmarked March 7th, 1994, from a La Crosse, Wisconsin pharmacy, later to be identified as Quillin's pharmacy. Inside were 35-millimeter negatives of what Bob Wood now thinks is the most important and authentic U.S. government document about extraterrestrials leaked so far. Bob Wood processed the negatives and eventually assembled each page into what it must have looked like when first printed in the late 1940s to the early 1950s by our government and stamped by the War Office. One subtle feature of the training manual's printed pages are slightly raised letter Z's. Bob Wood talked to an archivist for the U.S. Government Printing Office who supported the accuracy of the 1954 printing date stamped on the cover and explained that the raised Z's were caused by lint catching in the hot metal letters as they were used back then, and that caused the letter Z to be raised up a little bit in the hot lead press. Now, that's an example of the historically accurate details that Bob Wood has found in his efforts to authenticate the Psalm 101 manual. And here now, from Newport Beach, California, is retired aerospace engineer Robert Wood, Ph.D.
Because we have these 1,000 pages from 8 different sources, and we feel that we are better off to focus on something that we know is certain to be true. The other documents are often reinforcing the contents of Psalm 101. And in the process of trying to authenticate it, I talked to the Government Printing Office archival guy, whose name was Robert McCarter. That conversation convinced him. He said the printing process clearly demonstrated that it was printed probably in his printing press in 1954. And so this was a major factor in my thinking about the authenticity. The document itself, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology, Recovery and Disposal, it describes the background of the program that we had to study crashed flying saucers and how to analyze them, how to deal with the occupants, if there were any, and where to ship the parts in a very controlled manner. One of the big crunchers in my mind was a table that talks about where to send the parts. For example, for Area 51, it talks about sending aircraft and devices and power plants, but supplies and provisions it sends to the Blue Lab at Wright-Patterson, and then it has living entity goes to OPNAC BBS1. Now, we don't know what OPNAC stands for. In fact, that's one of the words or acronyms in this manual that I've never figured out. The media data go to Building 21 KB88, which is the building on Kirtland Air Force Base, which is also printed on the inside cover of the manual. So it's all very consistent.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the third piece of evidence that you and Ryan write about recently, and that has to do with finding that the postage meter and the number 2223773 was the postage meter number then that was issued to the drugstore.
Yeah, Quillin's drugs. And one of our investigators actually went there and was able to, working through the secretary, to hold the original in his hand.
We thought that this was a leaked document on film and that there was no physical manual for any of the outside world to get their hands on. It implies that it was kept at the Quillin's drugstore for some reason.
Well, there's a lot of speculation as to exactly who did what, but I would say that my feeling for the most likely situation was that a friend of the people who were involved in the drugstore had this manual, and for some reason unknown to anybody, they decided to photograph it and mail it to Don Berliner, who had just given a talk describing what kind of procedures you'd have if there had been a crash recovery process. My speculation would be that someone who had attended that symposium had the manual and decided that he would photograph it, he or she would photograph it, and then mail it to Don. But the manual was in the possession of the secretary of Mr. Quillin, I think, at the time that our investigator held it in his hand.
Joining his father in production of the new Psalm 101 website to reinforce the authenticity of the top-secret Magic Eyes Only training manual is Ryan Wood. Ryan has a business career in computers, semiconductors, and medical imaging. He also is the author of the 2005 book, Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology. And Ryan manages the MajesticDocuments.com website that he and his father first created that now has archived more than 1,000 pages of alleged government documents concerning the interaction of non-humans and their technologies with Earth. The documents also include government policies of denial and counterintelligence about the truth and facts of alien interactions with this planet. I asked Ryan about their Psalm 101 investigator in La Crosse, Wisconsin, who told them that the Quillin drugstore secretary handed him the actual Psalm 101 training manual that had originally been secretly photographed. Ryan, doesn't it imply that the Quillin drug secretary, Helen Stewart, is at the heart of getting the Psalm 101 manual from Quillin drugstore to Don Berliner?
Yes. She was probably handed the undeveloped film from her friend and said, "Can you please mail this for me?"
And this happened because why?
Somehow the whole psychological overlay of being frustrated with maybe the Air Force's treatment of Roswell.
Ryan, since the early 1990s, when you and your dad began working on the Psalm 101 document, have you ever been approached on the record or off the record by anyone in a military or government context telling you to lay off?
No one has ever approached me or urged me to stop on anything. I've gotten a couple of weird supportive letters, just keep working at it, signed The Watcher. Never anybody saying, no, stop.
And sometimes silence is the biggest affirmation.
Yeah, it's so clear that we got Air Force regulations that say UFOs are not fictitious. They're real, they're not imaginary. So they've clearly admitted in Air Force Regulation 200 that UFOs are real. Now the question is, are crashes real? And after writing a book that reviewed 74 UFO crashes from around the world, Magic Eyes Only, and have another 25 on my desk, we've had crashes all over the world, and many different countries have crashes. And so there's the extraterrestrial technology and testimonial like Corso that say, yeah, we've had reverse engineering of these things. It's pretty clear that crashes, reverse engineering, anti-gravity has been conquered and it's controlled in a classified way. And then you can go deeper into the bipolarizations of society between those people that know and those people that don't, and what is the E.T. agenda. It's a very complicated enigma, as you well know after your career at looking at this.
Yeah, and there have been some whistleblowers who have said that they had firsthand knowledge that during World War II, the United States stumbled into what radar could do, and that microwave radiation itself could be used as a weapon, and that we began using microwave radiation to aim at unidentified aerial objects on purpose to bring them down.
Yes, and I think just recently in the first annual report, I remember seeing a mention that we've downed a craft using our capability.
And if we did that in the years following World War II, what do you think the relationship is currently between non-human intelligences and our government and other human governments on the planet? Hostile, neutral, treaties?
Well, I think it's important for the listeners to recognize that there's not just one civilization. There's multiple civilizations with multiple agendas, and I think the answer is all of the above. Some are no relationship. Some of it is, yeah, there is a relationship. We have a treaty. We're doing some cooperative work with them. That's all, in my opinion, speculation. And then somewhere in between. The notion of the prime directive of Star Trek is just patently wrong. There is interference in an attempt to, I would think, save ourselves from ourselves and to move us along.
What do the two of you say to each other about what you think the current state of extraterrestrial relationship is with planet Earth?
Well, they're visiting. There's some faction within the government that's working with the E.T.s, most likely.
Which E.T.s?
I'm not sure. We know that's extremely important inside the government, and there's a continual effort to cover it up and keep it secret and hidden. They've figured out anti-gravity, too.
We are into the 21st century when telling the whole human family the truth seems the right thing to do?
I think it is, but the challenge with it is that it's a cascade of unknowns. The reaction of the public will be unpredictable, and maybe the public is really not the problem. It's the scientific community that suddenly says, well, you've known for the past 60 years that our physics is totally wrong, and you just let us go. Their paradigms gored.
But maybe it is time for the old false paradigms to be gored so that the whole planet can get on a new square that is honest about our relationship in this universe.
I agree. I'm with you. It's going to be hell to pay no matter what, whether or not you do it today or you do it 50 years from now. And I would just get it over with. Just do it. Rip the Band-Aid off. And there'll be whole layers of questions that keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. It might take them 3 or 4 years to answer all those questions.
Why are there animal mutilations? Why are there human abductions? Why is there a lot of physical evidence of interaction by extraterrestrials with humans that has been denied under policies of denial?
That's right. You almost need a cover story for the release of the information. While the world is in turmoil, by the way, we've been hiding the truth, and they might as well do it in the middle of World War III or an asteroid strike or a EMP pulse or major earthquakes or something to distract people from the ultimate focus on this topic. Ultimately, it's the question of who's in charge. Is our U.S. government in charge, or are the E.T.s in charge?
That is
good question.
Yes, that is exactly the focus of the question. And in front of me on my laptop right now, I'm looking at one of the pages in the very, very important Psalm 101 document, which Bob and Ryan have the whole document at their Majestic. It's called the Majestic Documents.com site. I have the entire Psalm 101 reprinted in my third book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness. I know that Bob and Ryan and I really do feel this is one of the single most important leaked documents. And that what I have on my laptop is paragraph 10, description of extraterrestrial biological entities, and the acronym is E.B.E.s. And this is quoting 1954 date-stamped War Office. Examination of remains recovered from wreckage of UFOs. That was an acronym that the government was using in the 40s to the early 50s as a distinction with the public use of UFOs. They added the B. Later they took that out and started using UACs, which were unidentified aerial craft.
Jeez, what a great story.
And well, this is true.
Jeez.
And that what this E.B.E. Type 1 in the Psalm 1, these entities are humanoid and might be mistaken for human beings of the Oriental race if seen from a distance. And it goes into great details. It goes into E.B.E. Type 2. These entities are humanoid but different from Type 1 in many respects, and it has to do with size and color. And then you get to the last paragraph in this manual that is teaching everybody how to gather wreckage, how to gather bodies alive and dead that are defined as extraterrestrial biological entities, and it says, quote, "It is not definitely known where either type of creature originated, but it seems certain that they did not evolve on Earth. It is further evident, although not certain, that they may have originated on two different planets." Remember all the work I have done with Anthony Sanchez and with Helen Luttrell on the whole hybrid stories that relate all the way back to Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 and migrating extraterrestrials who ended up here, but from two different planets in a solar system. And finally, under description of extraterrestrial technology, metallurgical analysis of the bulk of the debris recovered indicates that the samples are not composed of any materials currently known to terrestrial science.
Linda, Stanton Friedman was my first interview when I was 21. He's battled back from a heart attack. The guy has more energy than just about anybody I know, and he loves what he does. Yes,
he does. And a month ago, on December 26th, retired nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman wrote a detailed rebuttal to debunkers who have tried to stick hoax labels on some of the most historic and authentic UFO-related documents like the Psalm 101 and the Eisenhower document and the Cutler-Twining and all of these that he and Bob and I and others have investigated and feel that they are on the authentic list, and that the authentic list of documents includes the September 24th, 1947 President Truman memo to James Forrestal, who was the first U.S. Secretary of Defense, the July 14th, 1954 memorandum for General Nathan Twining from President Truman's special assistant, Robert Cutler, that mentions NSC, that's National Security Council, and MJ-12 Special Studies Project. It's printed right there in the memo. And the November 18th, 1952 Eisenhower briefing document. President Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 that created the Central Intelligence Agency, on September 18, 1947, specifically, some say, to cope secretly with the extraterrestrial presence while the U.S. government aggressively tried to get E.T. technology to back engineer for military and later commercial applications in the unsuspecting civilian world. The Psalm 101, Eisenhower briefing, and other Majestic 12 documents show that the President, his National Security Council, the new CIA, and Secretary of Defense Forrestal were working hard behind the scenes on UFOs and had counterintelligence deceptions such as Harvard astronomer Donald Menzel, who would be the biggest debunker of UFOs in order to keep the public and the media away from the truth. Meanwhile, as the November 1952 Eisenhower briefing document stated, quote, implications for the national security are of continuing importance in that the motives and ultimate intentions of these visitors remain completely unknown. It is for these reasons, as well as the obvious international and technological considerations and the ultimate need to avoid a public panic at all costs, that the Majestic 12 group remains of the unanimous opinion that imposition of the strictest security precautions should continue without interruption into the new administration, close quote. That was the passing of the presidency of Truman to Eisenhower on January 20th, 1953, along with the greatest secret of the land. Extraterrestrials exist and are here. And now, here is Stanton Friedman from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada.
When I first got Psalm 101, I published it in one of my books, Top Secret Magic. I read Bob's most recent paper, and I was quite favorably impressed. And I was the one who put Bob in the trail. Don Berliner inadvertently leaked the fact that he had got another MJ-12 document. We were talking on the phone. And I said, I got to have a copy of that. And once I got a copy, I asked him to send a copy to Bob Wood because Bob had a top-secret clearance. I have the greatest respect for Bob Wood, and in particular, he dug into the typefaces and monotype.
Is it fair to say that you would put the Psalm 101 training manual that says extraterrestrial entities and technology recovery and disposal in the documents that appear to be authentic?
Yes.
In your debunking the debunkers, let's start with the Truman Forrestal memo. How special that date, September 24th, 1947, in the context of looking at these documents for authenticity?
I looked at that date. You know, that memo has several things on it, but one of them, for example, is period after the date. And the numerical portion of the date, 24, 1947, is offline with the September and the rest of that heading. Obviously, it had been in a typewriter twice, which raises questions. Well, the period was easy. When I checked with people who had worked for Van Bush, that was a long time ago, and I looked at other Bush documents that I had, and they all had periods after the dates.
And during that period of time, putting periods after dates was something that was done in this government.
By Van Bush in particular, his office. That was one thing. The second thing is I checked with the Truman people and find out on what dates did Truman meet with Van Bush and Forrestal, James Forrestal.
The Truman Forrestal memo.
It's addressed to Forrestal, and it says with the advice of Bush and Hillenkoetter, Director of Central Intelligence. And it turns out that was the only day in an 8-month period when the three of them met together. And I dug into the Bush papers and found that he had made notes about that meeting. Bush and Forrestal often met together. They even played tennis, for goodness sakes. Forrestal accomplished so much when he was building the ships for the Navy during the war. And Bush headed the Research and Development Board, and before that, the Advanced Research and Development. things like the proximity fuse and the atomic bomb and advanced radar and stuff like that.
And President Truman thought so much of Forrestal that he appointed him the first Secretary of Defense in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's a vote of confidence, I would say, when we knew that the Cold War was heating up.
And it would make sense that something as sensitive as extraterrestrials being retrieved from a variety of places and bodies both dead and alive and technology, that the two people that President Truman would have reached out to would have been Vannevar Bush and Forrestal, that he selected to be the first Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, and so the fact that it was the only day, and I didn't know that except for asking, tell me all the days that they met together. Because if they met every week, then obviously it didn't mean anything. And also I asked, did anybody else ask that question? The answer was no.
And this would have been only 6 days after that date of September 18th, 1947, when President Truman signed into existence the Central Intelligence Agency.
That's right. I asked the Truman Library, who is still around from that time frame? And they mentioned George Elsey. And he's in the D.C. area, and he was there all the time that Truman was in office. He started work for Roosevelt. So I located Elsey, and I called him and asked him if I could send him some documents that relate to that period of time. I asked him about the Cutler-Twining memo because, how do you evaluate it? There's no signature on it, and we didn't know until later that Cutler was out of the country. So if there had been a signature, it would have been a phony document. So I hear from Elsey that Cutler and James Lay sat next to each other at all the meetings of the National Security Council. James Lay was the executive secretary. And I had told him that I had checked the Eisenhower phone records, and it turns out he'd had a call he and Lay had met in the morning of the date of the Cutler-Twining memo, and there was another phone conversation late in the afternoon. And I mentioned this to Elsey, and I said, it sounds to me like James Lay, who had been sent a letter by Cutler saying, keep things moving out of my inbox while I'm gone. I mean, that's a direct instruction.
Right.
Would he have possibly written such a memo? Elsey, he said, of course. And then he tells me that Lay and Cutler sat next to each other at all the meetings of the National Security Council. They each got copies of everything the other one wrote. And of course Lay would have written such a simple memo. All it says is that the time of a meeting has been changed. It also proves there's a statement in the Eisenhower briefing document about investigation began on July 7th, 1947. Well, it turns out that's a date when, according to both his pilot's flight log, and I later got Twining's flight log at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, it had been in a box that was classified. And then the next time I'd go back there, I would check, and, oh, yeah, they finally declassified. And I got Twining's flight logs. Proof from both of them that he did indeed go to New Mexico on July 7th. Then we have another letter from Twining saying that somebody out at Boeing, an old buddy apparently, he was going to go out there and see a new aircraft. Regret not being able to go there. Something of great importance has come up here, and I've been traveling a lot. Where did he go? New Mexico.
Right. And the question about Donald Menzel, the astronomer at Harvard who was listed on the MJ-12 committee with Truman, and what you have found about correspondence that he had with John F. Kennedy about clearances. Can you explain this very important piece?
Yeah, Menzel. That one was really strange. When I first saw the Eisenhower briefing document, the thing that stood out like a sore thumb was Menzel's name on the list of MJ-12 people. Now, Menzel was known as the biggest debunker of all. He'd written 3 anti-UFO books, gave talks when he provided testimony to congressional hearings. Totally negative. There's nothing to flying saucers. Everything's got prosaic explanations. So how could his name be on such a list? I was going through Van Bush's files, and I'd have been shocked if Bush wasn't on such a committee. And in Bush's papers, there was a listing under Menzel correspondence, so I got it, and it was a strange letter from an attorney in Boston. It's a letter from the attorney, Robert Proctor, to Vannevar Bush, telling him the decision has been reached and Menzel had been cleared of not being disloyal and they weren't taking away his Air Force security, his secret clearance. And thanks for Bush's help. And that one really shocked me. Why would Menzel have a security clearance in the first place? And why would there be a loyalty hearing? That made no sense. I knew Menzel had been in the Navy during the war. He volunteered at like age 40. Naval intelligence, it turns out.
And he was a cryptographer.
Well, yeah. I checked with the Harvard archives, and they indeed had big files on Menzel. However, you can't just walk in and look at them. Oh, yes, you need written approval from 2 members of the hierarchy of the astronomy department, and then if you want to see his unpublished autobiography, you've got to get his wife's permission in writing. Anyway, I wrote the letters to the people at Harvard and arranged with somebody who would introduce me to Mrs. Menzel, and I went there and sort of arranged things in advance because these files are in the back room of the library kind of thing. And I'm at the Kennedy Library, and I'd already seen his correspondence file at the Philosophical Society Library. UFO correspondence was there, and I had a list of what was in his University of Denver files, and I don't see anything that says UFOs, which wasn't surprising, but there was one, JFK. Well, that's interesting. I wonder what that's all about. So I asked for that file, and I was totally shocked when there is a bunch of correspondence between Donald Howard Menzel and Jack Kennedy, first-name basis, the two of them. It was 1960, the year in which Kennedy got elected. And Menzel had joined a Scientists for Kennedy political committee, and he was telling Jack that there is one area where I may be able to be of assistance to you. That has to do with the National Security Agency. Menzel said, when we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. And he said, I've had more connection with them and their Navy predecessor of anybody in the country, almost 30 years. And I'm looking at that. What in the world is this all about? Menzel working for the National Security Agency? I mean, I know he'd been in the Navy. It turns out he was head of communications unit in the reserve for many years in Cambridge. And so when I'm looking at his unpublished autobiography, there again we find the same thing. He worked with the NSA. He did consulting work for dozens of companies and for the CIA and the FBI and so forth. And I was totally shocked.
Think the world of that guy, Linda.
Oh, absolutely. And he has done such important work, just like Bob Wood has as well with Ryan, on all of this hard work that it takes to go through and wade through documents and archives. And something so important about that last piece on Donald Menzel, Harvard astronomer, wrote 3 books debunking UFOs. And Stan finds out that he clearly was on that MJ-12 list, meaning that he was operative like a counter-intel person who was doing super patriotic work for Truman and the administration to keep the public and the media at bay. And reading from page 4 in the Eisenhower document, which Stanton thinks is the single most important document, here is a quote right from page 4. This was the document that was given to brief Eisenhower in November before he took and was inaugurated in January. Here's a quote. Since it is virtually certain that these craft do not originate in any country on Earth, considerable speculation has centered around what their point of origin might be and how they get here. Mars was and remains a possibility, although some scientists, most notably Dr. Menzel, consider it more likely that we are dealing with beings from another solar system entirely. So this is the document that has the truth and the facts. And you put this up against how skillful Dr. Menzel, Harvard University, working in cryptography, brilliant mind was used to keep the public and the media completely disconnected from the fact that extraterrestrials were here and our government was studying them.
Linda, with Stanton still out there kicking around, who's out there in terms of true UFO investigators to carry the torch? Richard Dolan, people like that?
Well, I'm not sure what carrying the torch means.
Just keep fighting to get the answers. I mean, you're there, but are young people picking up this mission?
I don't know. I'm hoping that in the next year or two, this is finally going to come public, and that we have to leverage this open. This is crazy to be on a planet this concocted. And if in the next 2 years it all leverages open, then we're in a different world anyway.